The idea that one has really tried in many ways to understand how these public sector reforms during the 80s and 90s came about, how they can be so encompassing and so strong and so on. And there have been many ideas that this is, one has imported management concepts from the private sector, or it's all a political thing, so it was Margaret Thatcher that arranged all this, and that's the reason, and so on.
Could you say that this is another way of describing what one would call a drive for rationalization? You know, Weber's disenchantment.
Yes.
Well, you create entities that have their objectives, and they have measurements for their results, and they have an internal hierarchy, and they have boundaries, and they're well circumscribed, and all that makes it possible to control them, to make them transparent.
Yes. Yeah. But that's part of these sort of organizations in general, you could say. So here I would argue is here you go from one state organization to many organizations within owned by the state, or whatever you would like to use for term for the relation here. But so they are both organizations, and they are modern organizations, and they are rational and so on, both the traditional state and these small organizations. So that's so I think it's not that dramatic change. It's a change where the organization is, so to speak, and you find more organizations, and it's possible that it gives, because the state organization is so big and so complicated, the traditional one. So it's maybe so that, as you say, that it gives you, the effect is more transparency and maybe more control. I don't know.
Isn't that also the story about decentralization in private firms?
Yes. I mean, these tendencies you can find in private firms too. There you have one thing that has been important several years now is outsourcing, which means that you don't want to keep certain functions within your organization. You create a new organization, and then you have market relations with that organization instead of relations. And that is, I think, a parallel to privatization. And and you also have tendencies of decentralization in business firms and trying to create the business units that you own but still are little separate organizations. So this is a movement that exists all over the place, and it means that you create more organizations both in the private and the public sector. And then in the third sector, you have a similar tendency, but for other reasons. There you have this tendency that you don't to have a social movement these days. You don't have to have members, or very few members. In the old days, you had to have thousands of members. Now you can have an important movement that on the TV show in the evening, having 10 members, your friends and family and so on. And that means it's so easy to create social movements organizations too. So, and the effect of all this during this period, last 20 years, is exactly what you said before. We're getting more and more organizations in all these sectors. And which means that there is job for organization theories.
That's right. Would that also mean that you have more reflexive action? More conscious action?
Well, why?
Because in organizations, it's a question. It's a question. In an organization, do you act more according to taken for granted patterns or not? More or less so than in unorganized, quote unquote, contexts.
The question was,
do you act more according to taken for granted patterns, or do you act more according to reflexive patterns?
Yeah, more to reflexive. Yes, I would agree with you. I would say yes to your first question.
You would say more reflexive.
Yes, yeah.
And how would that then relate to the existence of institutions and the influence of institutions on action.
Now here I think we have an interesting development, because we have, on one hand, as I say, the creation of more and more organizations. So it would mean that, in a way, you would think that you would have more and more of sort of local orders that designed for the specific task of the specific organization, and so on. But on the other hand, we have another movement that is producing a lot of generalized knowledge about organizations, and which means which is a movement of generalization. So it means that these organizations, all these little organizations that could have, in principle, created a lot of local order, are importing generalized orders from, so to speak, the outside, and which that is, or described otherwise, the institution of the organization has more people relate to that and create organizations, but the institution has also been more complicated. So what they have to relate to is more than just a few aspects of organization. When they say that they are an organization, they are expected to have a lot of things immediately, because this institution is complex. It takes now, in most countries, it takes 3 years to study this institution before you are licensed to deal with organization matters. And that describes really the complexity. And it means that all these sort of, in principle, local orders or local organizations have to or do adapt to very generalized patterns and build complicated structures that reflect not these generalized patterns rather than their local order. So you get this paradox that you have really instruments for local orders, but you get much generalized order. So you get a lot of organizations that are doing the same things, and especially when it comes to sort of management practices that tend to spread to many. So and that is a theme that I've discussed when I discussed reforms, because that means that much of what organizations intend to do are really something that is generalized intended, that comes from ideas that are produced by research or by consultants or by experts on organizations. And these ideas tend to be very generalized and tend to be reflect more our sort of wishes about organizations and so on, rather than real organizational life, what is possible. So they tend to be a little unrealistic.